I'm Rebecca Goodman. I'm with the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group, and I'm co-hosting the event here at WWF. I just want to start with a few words, and I don't have a presentation today. I'm in the process of updating it because we are kind of in a in-between planning stage for this next implementation period. The Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group is a coalition between 7 international conservation organizations. I have my little cheat sheet right here so I don't forget them. They are the African Wildlife Foundation, Conservation International, the Jane Goodall Institute, Resources Institute, Wildlife Conservation, and our host here today, World Wildlife Fund. And so together, these organizations are tackling complex, continent-wide conservation challenges that really require a unified effort and bring together a wide variety of expertise. For those folks online, we can hear some of you, so if you could please mute your mic. Thank you. And I'll say we will have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So, you know, that's to the folks here in the room and as well as online. We were just awarded a cost extension by USAID, so we're now working on a 2-year work plan until the end of 2020, building on activities from the past 3 years, centered around 4 thematic areas in land and resource tenure rights, climate change adaptation, land use management, and global health linkages to biodiversity conservation, which is split into population health and environment, and freshwater conservation and WASH, water sanitation and hygiene. So you'll hear more about that moving forward. And I don't want to delay too much longer, but I suppose I should wait for to come back down. So I'm based here in DC. I'm with the African Wildlife Foundation currently, and I have a counterpart who's in Nairobi. She heads communications and engagement and working to develop relations with local partners regionally there in East Africa and expanding from there. And so if you're ever passing through, she's aiming to set up, you know, kind of a similar speaker series and build a community of practice over there. You can find us online at abcg.org. Also, of course, we have social media presence. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, that's the best way to find out about events like these, as well as recent resource releases and other news. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bas, who will introduce the group.
Thank you so much. Great timing. Mike, welcome back. So we are very delighted to be able to host Mike Knight today here. So Mike actually is in this room. He has 2 hats. So we are very delighted to have Mike with us, with his hat as our new transboundary leader for the Kaza landscape, which is a transboundary landscape in Southern Africa. He joined us about 6 months ago, based for the moment in Windhoek, Namibia. But he is not with us today with that hat on. He is also, and has been for many years, the chair of the IUCN African Rhino Specialist Group. And it is with that hat on that he's going to present us today the situation of the African rhinos on the continent. Some good news for a start. That's great. So before joining WWF, Mike has, well, many years, 30+ years experience in conservation in Southern Africa, with a main focus in South Africa. And he comes to us from Sand Parks. So maybe with that, since we have already a little bit delay, Mike, up to you. If I introduce you too shortly, maybe you can complement that with, yeah, looking forward to your presentation, which will be about maybe 30 minutes, so we have some time for questions and answers. People online, maybe just type your questions and we will take them as we come along. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, I really do appreciate it. Thanks, Lisa, for being my, what I call handler.
Your handler.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about these animals, which, as you know, in many cases are big engineers on the African landscape. And I'm going to talk about, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I'm not sure whether it's a train coming from the opposite way, but hopefully it's not. Okay, For you, a lot of the IUCN, what is it? It's a big organization. I'm just trying to find out what WWF is about, and it's a big organization. This is also a very big animal. And from the African Rhinos Specialist Group, we sit at this continental level, where we bring together all the experts from the red states, plus individuals that focus on a whole lot of things that we require within the Specialist Group. So we feed all the way down to national plans, and governments, and then we feed right up into the likes of CITES or into Interpol and into IUCN itself. I was, until the last 2 years ago, the chair of the SADC Rhino Management Group, which is the Southern African Development Corporation Rhino Management Group. We've just established an East African Rhino Management Group to try and make sure that we get regional groupings of people to get together, talk about rhino issues, no matter how controversial. Oh.
Here, it's easier to use the board.
Okay. At the moment, I have 50 members. They are all volunteers, except for one individual that I pay half his time, but everybody else is a volunteer. So we use that expertise to put us all together as a way of trying to consolidate the information that's required for the African continent. We've just come out of a meeting in February. We got all individuals together in Namibia, and this meeting would not have come about if we had not got support from WWF, South Africa. We also got US Fish and Wildlife support and a number of other donors that we could not have had that meeting. We try and get together every 2 to 3 years as a way of trying to understand what the situation of rhinos on the continent are, and ideally place this is going to be within a couple of months of CITES. So at least we go in there and know the best information possible. I'm just showing the slide, you don't need to read the detail. Basically, when it comes to rhino planning, you have to take into consideration a number of key aspects. The top one on the top left is obviously protection and law enforcement, and everybody understands that. Biological management. For the last 20, 25 years, we put a lot of emphasis on biological management to make sure that rhinos breed as quickly as we possibly can to provide that buffer against poaching. And I'll give you some, they put a lot of emphasis on this, trying to understand rhino biology. Political support. We would not be able to do what we can do if you don't have political support. And most of those national plans are signed off by the national government, which is good. Adequate financing is critical in supporting our rhinos, and I'll touch upon that. Socioeconomics, trying to make sure that rhinos are part and parcel of a viable wildlife industry. Enabling policies and legislation has to be in place. Communication and public support is critical. Coordination between entities. In most countries in Africa, it's often just a single government department that's responsible for conservation. In the likes of South Africa, where it's a federal system, it's far more complex with nine provinces and a national government, a federal thing. Capacity is always a problem. And what we do find, particularly in African law enforcement agencies, is a loss of capacity to a large degree and a loss of efficiencies. So in this consideration, trying to understand rhino conservation, we have to take all these things into planning. We have a hierarchy of plans from the national countries. They're normally reviewed every 5 years as a way of trying to make sure the government buys into those things. Those often translate into key performance areas in the national conservation entities. That is informed by the likes of the African Plan, which is an IUCN document, and one that we put together two and a half years ago that was presented at CITES in Johannesburg, was to talk about the regional aspects of cooperation in the African landscape. Not replicating these, but just emphasizing what we have to do regionally to make sure that our cooperation improves. Where we come from? Go back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had in the region of 40,000 black rhinos on the continent of Africa. That's the information that we have. There were some publications saying that they were down to about 60,000 odd. We can't get the confirmation of that information. But we do know from 1970s that we were dealing with about 40,000 black rhinos. At that time, we had about 4,000 white rhinos. in Africa. Between 1970 and the mid-80s and early 90s, there was a huge poaching scourge in Africa, and there was animals have been taken out because they were considered to be basically in the way. So there was a combination of poaching, there was fragmentation, and just exploitation. And we saw a monumental crash on rhino numbers down to the mid-80s and late 90s. The black rhino population crashed to just above 2,000 animals on the continent. In that time period, our white rhino population has been increasing, and it's been increasing, and it reached a peak close on 20,000 animals in 2013 thereafter. So the current population of rhinos, both black and white, is around about 25,000 at its peak, and it's just declined, but I'll get onto that. This is just to show that we went through a bottleneck, and this has come about because of concerted biological management, enforcement issues put in place, and making sure that we did the right things in the right places. So going back, 94% reduction in black rhino population from the 1970s to 1990s. White rhinos were almost taken to extinction, except for a small herd in Sicily and Falozzi in the late 1800s. And from 20 to 50 animals, the population increased to 17,000. Northern whites, in the 1960s, we had 2,200 northern whites. There were more northern whites in Africa at that time than there were southern whites. And they are now down to 2 animals. The history, obviously, we've lost 75% of the range to rhinos in total. And at the moment, there's 12 countries with rhinos in them. So by and large, the bulk of those rhinos are sitting in 4 countries, which we call the Big 4. Just to give you a bit of an indication of where these 2 subspecies were, the white rhinos occurred in southern Africa primarily. We always held that the distributional range north was the Zambezi River. And as you can see, they extend through to Namibia, and Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa, primarily fairly arid savannas. Then in the northern range, you had the northern whites that were from Uganda to southeastern Chad. If we look now at what has happened with the reintroduction from the population that was here, we've been able to reintroduce back to the former range with the brown dots. Okay, so they've gone into southern Africa, they've gone into Mozambique, out of Mozambique. So it's one of those countries that you put things into twice and they've gone extinct twice. Rwanda was the same before it came to black rhinos. And reintroduced what we consider to be probably extralimital into the likes of Kenya and also into Uganda. So what we've seen has been a major expansion of moving animals across the landscape. And that has been a fundamental aspect of rhino management. The 2 northern whites are sitting on a place called Old Pejeta in Kenya, and they were taken out of Drokolovo, which is a zoo in Czechoslovakia, to try and get these animals to breed under the African sun, exposed to African grasses. The female cycled, but unfortunately didn't conceive, so we've got two individuals left, 2 females. Let's go to the African white rhinos and southern whites. What we did in 2017, we've got close on 18,000. Just having done the specialist group, we're still trying to figure out the numbers. So for 2017 figures we're using, but by and large, we're looking at a situation that's improved. The numbers have gone down from 20,000 to 2015 to 18,000. But between 17 and 18, it looks like we may have a holding its own, but I can talk to that later. The 4 countries here, when you look at the distribution of white rhino, 86% of the white rhino sit within South Africa. And then Namibia, Kenya, and Zimbabwe have the remaining small portions of it. Where are they? They are sitting on 65% on state land. Private land accounts for 34%, and communal land less than 1% of the white rhino population. Let's go to black rhinos. Black rhinos, what we'll see here is that they were restricted to their range in Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Tanzania. They went recently extinct in the likes of Cameroon. And as part of that reintroduction program, we've taken animals back into Botswana, where the species almost went twice extinct, back into Zambia, into Malawi, into Rwanda, and just recently we've taken animals to Chad. that was taken from here all the way through to Chad, which is probably quite a long haul, but I'll talk about that. So when it comes to black rhinos, what we're looking at here is a population of 5,400 animals, close to 5,500. Remember in 1970 we had 40,000. The big four here are South Africa with 32, Namibia 34, and Zimbabwe and Kenya making up the larger proportion. So the big four are playing a role again. The good news is that when it comes to black rhinos, this is up from 2015. So we've added on another couple of hundred, which is good news from a conservation perspective. And I can talk about why that's potentially come about. And where they're sitting, to some degree, we've got state with about 67% of the land holding with black rhinos on. Private had 27%, and communal land is 6%. If we combine the black and whites together, and we look at the total rhino populations, we see that South Africa accounts for 74% of the continent's rhinos, with a total of 17,600 animals. Namibia is the next highest with 2,800, then Kenya, and then Zimbabwe. And Botswana has increased their population. They're now at only 2% of the continent's population, up to 200 and 500 animals. But in the last couple of years, they've added another 200 white rhinos and black rhinos. And then the other 7 countries only account for 2%. So here again, we've got the repository of rhino populations sitting in 4 main countries. And Southern Africa, by and large, has close on 95% of those rhinos. I mentioned to you translocation. Translocation has been a fundamental management tool that we've had. It started in the 1960s when we were able to catch animals with chemical mobilization. Prior to that, we couldn't move them. It was just a physical movement and they had high mortality. But chemical mobilization really opened up the world for us. We were able to catch these animals and move them across the landscape, take them out and spread them out over a number of baskets, as opposed to necessarily just being in one particular place. So it's been a fundamental management tool. This is the loading of the animals into the Russian Antonov for the animals that went to Chad. So it's just a sign. And this was the animals landing in Chad. It was quite an exercise to get these out. They had to make the strip. They had to obviously secure the facility. And the Russian pilots, the Ukrainian pilots, didn't negotiate the landing too well. And they took like 2 trees in the process. But that was sorted out with a piece of zinc, a few rivets, and a bottle of vodka, and they were gone the next day. Just a picture of the rhinos going into bomas. We developed our capture techniques over the years, where for long translocation such as this, they would go from boma to boma. But if you do fairly close moves, you just tranquilize them and then move them either on sledges or upside down, and we can carry them from one place to another. They're quite resilient and they're quite hardy animals. So translocation is a fundamental tool that we are able to deliver on. And this, in fact, is a capture that took place in Namibia. And that's the Deputy Minister from the Environment who loves the rhino operations and often goes out to most captures. That is an indication of the type of political support that one requires. To have upper government support is critical. This document should be on the CITES website. It isn't, for some reason, we do not know why. At this stage, there are a couple other documents. We've been waiting for the last month to make sure it's on, so I can't share it with you yet, but there it is. And it's a fundamental information document that gives the parties the information they're required to make the decisions around submissions to CITES. And some of the information that I will be talking to you are drawn from that report, so there will be stuff in there. So basically it's said that there it exists. As soon as it is available, I'll make sure it's available to all of you. Poaching. Everyone wants to know about poaching. It's almost like they want to know more about death than what they want to know about life. If we look at the rhino situation in poaching, this is reflecting the rhino population as smooth from 1992 all the way through to 2017. The black rhino population, as I mentioned, has been showing a progressive increase. We've had that dip from 2010 when poaching obviously started taking its impact. What we have seen is a decline in the white rhino population from 2012-13 and a decline which we see at the moment. Now, this is primarily a result of Kruger National Park. And Kruger National Park is the single largest repository of rhinos in the world. So whatever happens there is going to potentially have a huge impact on our rhino conservation. This is just reflecting the poaching stats, the white rhinos and black rhinos. And as you can see, the white rhinos are in preponderance, they're easier to poach, which is good news because you're talking about a critically endangered black rhino and a vulnerable white rhino based upon Biodiversity. So for the first time, poaching figures have dropped between 1,000 animals lost in 1 year. 879, that was confirmed in 2000 at our meeting recently. And that is good news. That is very good news. And as you can see, the reduction in poaching has been year on year from 2015. That's also good news. So it means a lot of the effort that people are putting into place is working, that we've seen a reduction. But people only seem to focus on the number of animals. It's the compounded effect that has a biological implication for us. If we lost 8,400 rhinos over the last 10, 12 years on the continent, this is compounded by the loss of those breeding females and the loss of those juveniles breeding themselves. So we've lost in the region of 10,500 rhinos potentially from our breeding stock. And that has been the impact of poaching. And remember, when it comes to poaching, these are the figures probably in fairly minimum idea because in some of the big national parks, it's actually difficult to estimate the poaching 100%. You could be missing up to 20% of carcasses. At its peak, it was 3.7 rhino a day were being lost. And by and large, that was in Kruger. We've seen the Kruger loss go down from 860 to 600 to 550 over the last 3 years. So it's been a reduction. And they've set as part of their KPIs to make sure they reduce it below 3 if they possibly can. And get that down as fast as they can. The figures, the numbers aren't important here. This is basically poaching across the continent, both black and white. It's the arrows that are. As you can see, there are more green arrows, and they're upwards. There are a few red pointing downwards, and that's Kruger National Park. And the Kruger issue has been compounded by two things. We've had poaching. They are recording in the region of 2,000 incidents a year on poachers getting into that park. From a geographic perspective, our eastern boundary is 365 kilometers long. It links onto Mozambique. And as you know, Mozambique does not necessarily have the most efficient law enforcement, doesn't have the best wildlife acts, and has a high state of poverty. And the western boundary, you've got 2 to 3 million people. So it's from a rural society to a peri-urban society. So they sit with a huge task. So what we've got here is a reduction in rhinos. The proportional loss of animals to poaching has been the same. Some people say, oh, but poaching's gone down because you've got few animals. Yes, there's truth in that. But what they've been able to do is to reduce the poaching and at the same time hold their own. Unfortunately, we don't have the converse of what it would be if we just let poaching go. You can model it, but we don't have that. The situation is we're looking at a better and improved thing. And one thing you want to do is to encourage the law enforcement, the protected area agencies about what they're doing and how well they're doing. And the cost implications of being able to deliver on that is huge, but I'll just touch on that. Swaziland is highlighted there. They haven't lost animals the last 2 to 3 years. They're only a small population, but they lost 20% of their white rhinos to drought. And that was with supplementary feeding. So the drought is having a huge impact. And these are the things that compound our problems, particularly when we have small problems, populations. And the drought is probably going to continue. So I think the situation in Kruger probably will not get immediately better. And the worst thing about it, if your animals are suffering from drought, they lose their calf, they don't conceive, so you lose a 1.5 years breeding. So it's a compounded effect. So more green arrows, that's good news. That's just an indication of the Kruger populations dropped from 8,700 in 2015 to 5,100. So 40% reduction in the white rhinos. The black rhinos are going the opposite. They're increasing. And the reason for that is because white rhinos are like cows. They just forage in open grasslands. They live in smaller groups. They're easy to poach. The black rhino lives in thicker bush and is more difficult to poach. And then they're normally in their ones or twos, but they do periodically get bigger groups. Okay, I think it's an important point we have to emphasize here is the role of the private sector in the conservation of rhinos. If we look at the South African situation, we see that from 1989, when the private sector started getting involved in black rhino conservation, that was primarily made available through animals being initially sold on auctions, and they were then moved out there. They sold them in small batches to private sector. Private sector would buy them and then put them on. The good thing about that was we were finding alternative homes for rhinos, and the conservation agencies were generating revenue, which is they need to fund their conservation activities. The number of black rhinos on private land in South Africa is now close on over 500 black rhinos. In the last, I would say it's the last 15 years, 10 to 15 years, WWF funded by Netherlands have been doing the black rhino range expansion project, where they were incentivizing private landowners with big portions of land to get together. The conservation entities would provide them the black rhinos, provided they secure them and they take care of them, just to make sure. And then the incentive for those private landowners to get involved were basically twofold. They like rhinos, which generally these landowners are, and they can get some form of return from tourism, because it diversifies their tourism product. So that has had a major increase in putting rhinos into bigger portions of land. And if you can consolidate your land holdings and drop fences, even better. The white rhinos has gone from, is up to the region of close on 7,000 on private land. If we look at Africa as a whole, from 2012 to 2017, we've seen the proportion of white rhinos sitting on private land has gone almost close to 50%. So the private sector are playing more and more role in the conservation of rhino. Now, Africa is a landscape where you've got freehold and leasehold land and communal land in southern Africa. The rest of the land in the rest of Africa is largely communal land and state land. So it's primarily taking place in southern Africa. That means South Africa, Namibia, to some degree Botswana, and Zimbabwe until a few years ago when Robert Mugabe decided to do some strange things. Okay, so what you've got here, 2012 to 2017, an increase in private sector involvement. Looking at black rhinos now for Namibia, what we see here is the black rhino private sector have about 23% of the rhino population on their lands. And that's maintaining. They have an important program called the Custodian Program, where they're putting rhinos onto that. They don't, ownership is not transferred. They're just making the land available. And in Namibia, the communal land holding is really important, because we've seen a population of about 160 rhinos in northwestern Namibia that don't have a strong paramilitary background. And there they rely upon tourism and observers in that landscape. It's a totally different type of landscape to try and secure those rhinos. The communities are involved, so it's a strong positive impact of community-based type natural resource management that's having a very positive deliverable there. In Kenya, we can see that the private sector playing a major role. They did play a major role in the 1980s, 1990s when they made land available. There is no transfer of ownership. There's still state rhinos in that case, but here it is for reflecting that they're playing a role. So private sector ownership ranges between 26 to 50% in any one of those countries. Rhino conservation is expensive. And this is just to give you some insight to the type of costs one's thinking of. I'll use Kruger National Park as an example. Kruger requires about $8,000 a year per square kilometer. $800, say. It's a total of about $16 million to run the conservation and protection of rhinos. That's what they require. But it's a scale. You're talking about 2 million hectares. What's that? 4 million acres. Over $74 million over 5 years. So it translates to about $1,600 per rhino to protect that rhino. How does it compare with other protected areas across the continent? They range from $1,200 per rhino up to $10,000 per rhino. And some of those conservation areas are in Kenya, where you've got very, very intense small properties, and they're very donor heavy, and they've got a lot of money flowing into those particular areas. And security costs have been escalating about 75% per annum. It's huge, those costs. So much so that we've seen a debunking where the private sector are getting out, so this is expensive, I don't want to be involved in this. It's expensive in the form of security costs, not only as hitting their pocket, but at the same time, security from the point of view of their families and their staff who have been threatened and exposed to violence. So it becomes a very, so we've seen alone, I think, about a 20% reduction in the state properties with rhinos in South Africa alone. Then there's one particular large land holding with private white rhinos in South Africa. There's 1,600 rhinos alone. Just for comparison, he is spending $350,000 a month on security, on managing that, of which 60% is security alone. That translates to about 2,600, which is in that ballpark. So rhino conservation is expensive if you focus on rhinos. We have to look at sustainable forms of funding. And how are we going to do that? We're going to have to look at incentivizing conservation. What we've seen is with the private sector coming in, making their land available and footing the bills, has been a transfer of responsibility and ownership and costs, no longer in the state. But you've got to keep that incentive going. And how do we do that? Particularly when the value of rhinos is going down. Rhino impact investments, we're looking now to try and get money from the investment world so that we can plow it into areas for investment funding. Unfortunately, that's focused on particularly small reserves where they can account for the numbers of animals. But if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, you have to go for the likes of Etoshas and the Kruger National Parks. But the scale of attribution, they say, is not going to reflect their impact. But really, if you want to have the biggest impact, that's where you need to be going for it. Wildlife credits is another form of potentially funding it, where you're now looking at smaller donors paying for outcomes. So those could be the people that donating to WWF, is rather paying the landholder that's got these animals on the land to pay for an increasing population of the species in that landscape. But some will pay, and the case of community lands, certain species are higher value than others. They like the plains game, they don't like particularly elephants too much unless you can get the full value of them, and they don't like lions very much at all. So wildlife credits you can explore. Then we have to need to the issue of upscaling. The investment, rhino impact investment, will only work to a limited degree at a species level. We've got to take it to the landscape. The landscape is a protected area or even bigger. So we've got to think along those type of lines to secure the protected areas. So here again, we go back to the importance of protected area conservation. Costs, the other costs, human lives. Human lives and ranges. We've heard a lot of things buzzing around at the moment. But this is the element that's been forgotten. The rangers, having come from a protected area management agency, the rangers are detail-hard. These individuals came into conservation for conservation's sake, not to become paramilitary people at all. So what you've seen is basically retrained paramilitary people. That's not their life's ambition that they're becoming that. That has huge loss accountability for human life. And Kruger lost the first ranger last year for the first time, which is not bad considering the number of contacts. But the other entities have lost rangers all over the landscape. The emotional and psychological impact is huge. And we mustn't forget that. Often we don't give that attention that's required. Because if you don't take care of that, they can't deliver on that security. The opportunity costs are huge. 10 to 15 years ago in South African national parks, we were spending probably 5% on security. Now it's 85%. So what's happened? The huge opportunity costs. Conservation's going down. They're not doing the conservation things they should be doing. They're just running after poachers and chasing them. With that, you get infrastructure degradation. If your infrastructure goes down, your tourism goes down, your money revenue goes down, you start now into a bit of a vortex. Crime, the price of horn being offered to some of these individuals, the temptation is great. And so you always have to worry about that. And corruption feeds in. Reputation, we hear about the issue of green militarization. Ideally, you want the rifle over your shoulder with the daisy, not the barrel. making sure that you want to avoid this whole idea, the stigma of the militarization aspect about protected areas. The corruption disease I've spoken about. Then we have to think about the messaging. And the messaging is so important that we need to get out there. Is the messaging that we're getting out, giving the information to the people that we don't want to have the information? But I'll talk about that just now. And in the African context, is this the war of the elite on the poor? When they start saying we're spending more money on rhinos as opposed to building homes for people, we have a difficult argument. This is just to show you the loss in the South African context and values. As you know, being based upon sustainable use, the sale of wildlife was an important revenue generator. We were not able to, in Sam Parks, expand our conservation footprint if we weren't able to sell rhinos, selling one biodiversity asset to conserve another. But from 2014 downwards, the price has lost close on 70% of its value. What is this translated into? The loss of the asset value, the poaching loss, which is the compounding effect, the breeding loss, which is also compounded. The total loss in US dollars is about 700 million in that time period to the private sector largely, and to the state sector that weren't able to get that return of value. Add on to that the increase in security costs. This has actually gone into the CITES document as a way of trying to illustrate the cost of conservation. And then, if you come out with the value of an animal, it's about $1 million, it's close on $100,000. When the courts come to dishing out a fine, some of the maximum fines is only 70,000. So there's no link there. So being able to sell our case as part of aggravation of sentence, we have to be able to argue these type of things. And where we have been able to argue it, the magistrate or judge has pushed up the fine. So, around messaging, what we have is a situation that the producers in Africa with rhinos, we've got the supply chain with all the poachers and all the consumers in Asia. The message is, what's written out there is around the number of rhinos everyone wants. If you get an interview by a press, how many rhinos you got? Okay. How many we poached? What's the price of them? There's millions of users out there that want this stuff. Rhinos are going extinct. So what does that send? It sends a message, there's a product, it's easy to get horn, there's money in it, there's a market, and it will increase because your rhinos are getting scarcer. Is that the type of message one wants to get out? So what should be written is, our rhino populations are well managed. Poachers face a risk. There's high risk from the whole spectrum of things. Don't use it, particularly in illegal medicines and stuff like that. Rhinos will not go extinct. So we have to then say, it's not easy to get, it's not worth the risk, stay out, maybe look at some sustainable options, and then it's not a good investment at the moment. It is for some people, but certainly not us. And that's the situation when we come to communication. Turning that around, and we look at, this is where poachers are here. These are the few criminal guys that distribute money and the consumers. We need to collapse the crime networks, and we need to make sure that we give the people that are living with the wildlife the economic choices they require. And so the focus of our activity is there. The focus of our activity should be there. If you look at just the rest going on, it's all in the poachers and very little actually in the couriers and buyers. But in the last few years, there's been greater emphasis to try and make sure we get these middlemen that are money bags that are actually making things happen. So there's been a 13% level increase in the 3s and 4s, which are these intermediate people that are providing the money to the poachers in the first place. And quite a good success rate only for those cases that go to court. It's the ones that don't go there that's the problem. So where should we be putting our effort? I've given you some hints on that. If you now look at this whole idea of probabilities, what you want to do is to reduce the probability of someone deciding to poach, the probability of knowing basically a planned poaching event, the probability of detecting an illegal entry, of detecting an incident, or capturing illegal immigrant entrants, or probability of convicting an illegal entrants, and the probability of disrupting criminal networks. Where's our effort going into? It's largely around tracing our tail, chasing the poachers here. That's where it's going into. People may say, but we're getting a response from that. But if we're clever, we have to stop them before they even get anywhere near the rhinos, because when the rhino's dead, it's not much use to us. What has been an important thing, I'm just going to touch on a few things to give you an example, is dehorning. Dehorning has been used as a management tool. It was started in Zimbabwe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It was very effective in reducing poaching then. Namibia are doing it, particularly in certain parts of their conservation areas they're working on. They've done some areas in Tosha and elsewhere, but they're out there. But this is expensive. And you have to do it every 2 to 3 years because that horn grows 5 centimeters a year. So it's once you're committed to do it, it's going to cost. But the poachers will still go after these animals sometimes because there's still value in that horn at the stump. But really what you're doing is taking that incentive. I'm moving. Almost. Okay. Another tool that's come out to use is Erodus, is a genetic database where they've got a close on, I think, 35,000 samples. It's the single largest genetic deposit DNA database of rhinos. It's effective. So from any poaching scene, they've got the app, they can upload it with all the pictures of the scene directly onto the CAS document. It can be used directly in court cases. So you don't have this translation lost. An important tool which is used in many, many cases. When they bring in the genetic data and the prosecutions, it normally just gets a case sorted out there and then. What has happened now, primarily what you see, rhino horn have been taken in their full length to the likes of China and Vietnam, which is still the main source areas. We have got them producing beads in that part of the world, but now, because of the pressure that's come on, they've moved that industry to the likes of Africa. So that makes it a bit more difficult to detect. So this is, and these individuals are very, very adaptive, far more adaptive than the state authorities in trying to stop it. So this is how things are changing, and there are other forms of use as well. So just to summarize, if we're going to address this in the future, we have to have a whole government response. Some of the money that's coming from USAID has been, particularly in Namibia, has been very, very instrumental in making sure you get the government departments and the local NGOs all together talking and identifying how to work on that space. Critically important. Regional cooperation is critical to make sure that the information shared across those boundaries. If you don't have that regional information shared, we are just stopping at our boundaries. And that, there again, USAID money has played an important role in that. It's not a wildlife crime, it's an economic crime. And we must make sure that comes in because you're undermining the tax revenue basically for that state. As soon as it's a wildlife crime, it's a wildlife issue. It's not. It's an economic issue. Effective law enforcement, if you want to have the most impact, break the networks. How do you do that? Follow the money. Follow the money, we require a lot of technology to do that. Do we get involved? I mean, IUCN, we're just saying this is the right way to do it, but we need partners to help us with that. Enabling legislation is critically important. Mozambique, obviously, at one time it was probably a greater offense to steal chickens than it was to kill wildlife. So they've been changing their laws, which is good. Angola, which is part of the footprint I work in now, has got similar type of laws that are not as effective. Increasing the value of wildlife so that we can pass the burden onto the private sector to a greater degree and use them as funding sources. Responsible and ethical use when it comes to the sustainable use is critical. Translocations remain critical for our expansion programs. We mustn't forget our social mandate, that people are not less important than rhinos. We must make sure that our messaging is clear and focused, depending on what stakeholder you're aiming at. If you want to talk to poachers, and we don't send enough messages to poachers, as opposed to sending messages to other elements of society. From an economics perspective, we do need the pricing data from the source right to the sink, so the economists can actually understand the market, because otherwise all the pricing stuff is underneath the table. We don't have that. That's critically important. And one of the most important things is to be innovative and experiment like this. Thank you.
Okay, that was a lot of information. Thank you very much. Just a small correction that in the Namibia case, it was mostly the whole of government approach with NGOs coming together in the support strategy was firstly funded by State Department INL, but yeah, so
Thank you.
we have the room after one, so for people that would like to stay on, they can stay on. Now the floor is open for any questions to Mike.
Hi. So you talked about breaking the crime networks, the middleman. If you doesn't another middleman come in as
Yes,
long as they're new
But you've got to disrupt it. You've got to
disruptive?
disrupt it as a key element.
Okay. South Africa is a relatively rich country. Why doesn't the government do more to protect Kruger? I know it's a loaded question, but we're friends.
Well, also not even Kruger, but also like if KZN, like why is Zambezi also completely underfunded?
Well, if you consider the funding ratio that's going into those parks proportionally better than elsewhere in Africa. To a large degree, what has happened there is the inefficiency of the police force, SAPS. The wildlife authorities, basically their mandate stops at the boundaries. The police essentially take over outside. And when that breaks down and they do not see that the poaching of an animal or a rape case or a murder, and they start prioritizing what the crimes are, they're giving more attention to the human ones as opposed to wildlife. That's why at the moment there is a integrated security plan for South Africa, but it has not been signed off because once they sign off, they have to commit to the budget. And they haven't been able to do that yet. So really it's because of inefficient policing on the outside. So much so that the law enforcement agencies within the parks are doing that intelligence work outside, which is not their ambit, but they are doing it. And in the case of Kruger is to make sure that they have more arrests outside than inside. As a way of trying to influence outside. So it's really that breakdown in the efficient law enforcement agency in South Africa. That's really to some degree. Have we got full commitment from the government? To some degree, yes. From the National Wildlife Department, there have been entities doing so. But there again, you've seen a mismatch in commitment from different things. You've got to have commitment from right across the government, whether it be from customs and excise, right through to law enforcement and security.
As follow-up, what's public opinion in the country of South Africa about the poaching of all these animals from there?
Well, generally, most people are very happy it's improving. The message going out that we've lost fewer rhinos, that could, as I mentioned to you, primarily because of Kruger, because there may be fewer rhinos on the landscape. But really what it is not undermining the law enforcement activity. By and large, there is a feeling of, we've got the figures of a reduction in poaching in the last 3 years. That's good news. If it was going the opposite way, they'll be jumping up and down. But you've got your detractors and any situation. There was another question here.
Yes, I have several questions, but I'll start with two main ones.
Can everybody introduce themselves quickly?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. My name is Cheryl Brown. I'm with the Humane Society of the United States / Humane Society International. I have questions about the focus messaging and trying to have a certain message to poachers. There's a lot of organizations that are working on lowering the demand of rhino horn and other wildlife parts, trying to get the public to, as you said, not see it as a viable investment, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of messaging, I mean, how are we able to reach the poachers and disrupt the crime network, and how are you getting that messaging to them besides them seeing that poachers are being killed, that they're being arrested? Because that's obviously not a strong enough message.
Okay, well, that's a strong enough message. I mean, I think obviously from the messaging aspect it's a critically important one, how you're going to deliver on it. You're going to have to look at them and say that going into this part of the world is dangerous. You potentially lose your life and your family lose their form of income. So you've got to offer them that. We've got to be also messaging and say, look, this is not the right way to go, maybe another way. So critically messaging is important around the risk versus the reward. That's got to go out. And I think at the other end, on the demand side, where you need to be looking at the messaging there, and I refer to some of the recent studies that have been undertaken. From my perspective, I'd like to see a good analysis of the the efficiency of those demand reduction strategies. The one that's been done in China is showing that there hasn't been strong behavioral change, which is a bit of a worry. So it means that either the messaging is wrong, and you're talking in the wrong way to a different cultural base. So in the African situation, you've got generally people that are desperate for money are going to look at alternatives. So we have to be looking at alternatives as a way of trying to, but don't take that risk. That's a key thing. So messaging, it's a critical thing, and how you get those messages across is important.
And are there efforts when they do disrupt the crime networks? I've read a little bit about people trying to offer those poachers different jobs to either protect the rhinos, to try to get them into a different economic situation. What's the basis of that, and what's being done so far?
Well, it takes one to catch one. So, and in many cases, it's not only that, in other situations where you've got fish poaching, you've often brought in the fish poachers to do the work, and it encourages that. And I think what you really want to try and do is say, these rhinos are part and parcel of a broader landscape, which generates jobs and revenue for that landscape, and you're participating in that positive part. So messaging is a difficult thing, but you've got to make sure you get them quite specifically identified for your stakeholder that you're aiming at. And it varies from those that are important and those that are influential to those that aren't.
Okay, we have maybe one more question from the group, from Nikhil, and then we look for questions online, and then people are free to go, and people that want to stay on for a couple of more minutes are free to stay as well. Nikhil.
Cool, thanks. Good question. So Nikhil Advani, WWF. Since they're collecting all the genetic data, and given that southern whites went through the bottleneck, are they attempting to quantify genetic diversity across the species?
Yes.
And what does it look like?
Well, white rhinos to pauper.
Right.
Okay, but they're still breeding, they're still going well. But what they have done is a paper that's come up by Yoshim Woodley quite recently. It's showing that the northern white and southern white were genetically connected up to 10,000 years ago, which is just yesterday. So what that does, that changes our whole thinking about maybe we need to look at the landscape in between that potentially can support white rhinos as available, as opposed to saying, here's the distribution range of southern and northern, but now you use that as potential habitat to expand. At the same time, he's done some work on the black rhinos, where it looked like trying to identify different genetic pools and how we should be managing them. But by and large, it's in the line with what we've been managing with 4 subspecies or ecotypes.
Do we have a question from people that are with us online?
I've got one. It's David Naidu from WWF. I was interested in your cost data, and I had 2 questions on that. And the first was that in the Kruger example and others that you presented, were those costs specific to rhino conservation, or did they involve some sunk costs just associated with the protected area in general? And then the second question is, do you have similar information for the communal lands in terms of the costs of rhino conservation? And can we say anything about the cost effectiveness of rhino conservation on communal lands versus in private or protected areas?
Okay, the cost of the Kruger information was the entire cost. So building in the full management suite of activities. It's quite difficult to try and separate those particular costs for that landscape. Don't worry, we tried, but it's tough. Reference to communal, do you want to add some comment on that? The work that you've been exposed on?
Well, I think that the Namibia example with rhinos on those communal lands, there you have the largest free roaming black rhino population on the continent, where actually it's an example of not militarization of efforts. It is really community managed. Those community rhino rangers are not armed, have no paramilitary training. And there it is really a combination of those communities seeing the value of rhinos on their lands and therefore being the eyes and ears on the ground, and a good collaboration between those communities and basically intelligence services and the Ministry of Wildlife. So basically they give information and intelligence to those services. And we have seen for the last 18 months, 0 poachers rhinos being poached on those lands, and quite a few incidents of attempted poaching being intercepted before it actually happened. So that's another model.
I guess my impression would have been is that the communal lands costs would be much lower than the other costs. But I guess, is that true?
Yes, it is smaller.
Is that like Damara land, or where in Namibia is that? Where does that work?
Maraland Cornfield. Yeah, northwest.
And is that they work because they're so remote?
It's remote, it's isolated, and it's open landscape,
Yeah.
which makes it easier. Once you start moving into a far more busy landscape, it becomes more difficult. And I think you'll have to have a combination of things.
Yes, Lisa.
Yeah, Lisa Steele, WWF. I'm interested at your last meeting, did you discuss new countries or new areas where you may be able to reintroduce rhinos? What do you see on the horizon as important new areas for new populations? Or are you not allowed to talk about that?
No, I can. I mean, I think there are not necessarily new countries per se, but I think there are new areas within existing countries. And it's also looking at fortifying existing populations, such as the one that's gone into Akagera in Rwanda, is to boost that, is to take more animals into Chad, because we lost some of the animals that were taken in there, is to boost that. There are plenty of sites available for rhinos. I don't think necessarily we want to go and expand new countries depending on whether they have all the criteria that tick off easily. So boosting the existing ones to make sure that they can produce rhinos as quickly as possible is important. So we have a whole list of those type of areas.
I think you mentioned innovation and experiment. I'm wondering if you could talk at all about types of innovations and experiments that either you see most needed or that people are already trying that you're interested to see the results of.
Some of the innovative stuff is on tagging and low-cost tagging, fairly long range. I mean, what they call something FOX. It's a low-frequency type tags, which are important. It's been able to monitor your animals in small areas, which is critical, and how frequently you can do it. That adds to your security. So that's some of the innovation that's coming through. Obviously, the translocation and drugs is ongoing as key things. I think some of the innovations we need to be looking at is being strategic in how you deploy your conservation staff based upon understanding where the roots are and all those things, and modeling basically on probabilities of engagement. So I think that way you can be clever in trying to engage the landscape.
And I think we could add also that additional effort in most of those countries now in looking more at the intelligence services, looking at financial assets. So indeed moving a bit away from always what you called chasing the tail towards those middlemen and looking where the financial streams are going, and not only arrest them and give a fine, but also looking at their assets and asset forfeiture and trying indeed to disrupt those middle pieces.
I think also some of the innovation is trying to make sure it sounds simple, but is getting the customs officials and law prosecuting officials together from a group of countries to share information about what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. And understanding that those persons are one phone call away to share information, which is important.
Hi, who
So
is
there's
this?
a whole lot of focal areas for innovation.
It's Tessie that's, just mute her.
I did. Any other question?
I have a question about translocations. Are you translocating only rhinos from unprotected areas to protected areas? And if not, what's the basis of reasoning for that?
From protected to protected.
If the population gets too big for the landscape, like he showed a slide where
Okay.
they moved.
Yeah.
But that's the only reason they're translocating.
No, you'll move them away basically if they're exposed to a risk. You may move them for biological reasons. In other words, you've got fairly small populations, you've had a bull that's contributing a long time, you move him for biological reasons. There's a whole suite of reasons why you translocate animals. Not just for protection, but it's for biological management
And
as
also
well.
to grow new populations.
Grow new populations.
And what's the success
Supplementing.
rate? Is there any issues? Because when you translocate an animal, there are so many different factors, even though they're a hardy animal. What's the success rate of translocating and then them actually flourishing in that new environment?
Well, the loss is less than 1%,
Okay, that's
which
good.
is very good. Which is very good. I mean, it's come down over time. I mean, they lost them in Kenya recently, which was a tragedy. But generally, our losses are reduced to a minimum. In the case of the Chad translocation, we're not sure why we lost 4 of the 6. We haven't had it before. People talk about maladaptation, but they went through 3 different translocations, and I think what you could have had was Their gut flora got really turned around and buggered around, so that affected them. So I think it's a combination of stuff. We've gone through the risk assessment now. We're trying to understand it, but African parks are not taking their foot off the pedal. They want to get more in, and that's one thing that we have to keep doing.
But I think there is a lot of, let's say, emphasis on those last two cases, but indeed, I mean, translocations have been going on in Southern Africa for thousands of animals have been moved successfully and established in new populations. And for species like black rhino, another reason to translocate is if they are too densely together, their breeding rate goes down. So also just getting from overpopulated areas to new areas that increases.
In Southern Africa alone, there's 140 odd individual black rhino populations, groups. In South Africa alone, there's over 300 private landowners with rhinos. That came about through translocation.
Maybe I would say two last questions and then we sort of close this out because Mike is other.
Okay, so I was wondering, have you looked at the Nepal situation? Because there's a very dense population, rhinos and very enclosed species, and yet zero poaching for several consecutive years.
Yes, we often look at Nepal. I mean, obviously got quite a high expenditure rate per square kilometre. You're also dealing with a different type of cultural background.
The different social system.
Different social system, different cultural background.
Yeah.
And in fact, in many cases to Southeast Asia, they wanted the Southern African experience to go and show them what to do with the Sumatra rhinos and say what they're doing is wrong. So I think it's a matter of learning from all those situations. What are they doing that's right? What can we replicate to our side and vice versa? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
last
thanks.
question.
Last question. I'm Lou with WWF Traffic, and I'm interested to see if you can talk more about what you had mentioned between the conversation between the elite and the poor and that dilemma. You know, how do you justify, like you said, to a community that a rhino costs more than a house, and you know what conversations work, and what's the pushback, and how do you move beyond that?
At the moment, and I use the South African examples, there's very few, with the exception of 2 or 3 areas where there are rhinos on community land. In most cases, the portions of land are fairly small, so they can't actually physically keep them. So how do you translate it? You either translate it as part and parcel of the wildlife economy. That's a larger thing. The rhinos are only part of that. We want to bring you into the wildlife economy through this whole spectrum of species, of which rhinos are just part of it. So if you're selling the case about improving their linkage to the wildlife economy, rhinos are thrown into that ambit. In the case of Namibia, they've got a very good example where they are bringing in the communities through the CBRNM program and increasing the value of wildlife. And that's through utilization and many forms take place. So if you can improve the value of wildlife versus the alternative like livestock, and you move it basically high in value, they're going to put more value on that. If it goes the reverse and they just see it as nothing more than a cost to them, then you're basically in the wrong side of that fulcrum. So it's about incentivizing and value and ownership and being able to be part of the decision-making process. So it's a whole process to get involved in.
Yeah, and what does that conversation even look like if it's someone that doesn't have, you know, fresh water, that short-term versus long-term vision of, you know, being involved in conservation decisions versus just being able to feed their family or, you know, collecting flat leaves, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a bigger picture as well, which rhinos are only part of that story. So you have to see it in totality.
All right, well, thank you all so much. Thanks, Mike.
For sure.
Thank you, everyone.